So good morning or good afternoon. I'm Lisa Letsalo from RDA Europe, and I'm happy to welcome you all to this breakout session by the Community-Based Catalog of Requirements for Trustworthy Technical Repository Service Providers Working Group. This working group focuses on the one hand, on developing modular certification recommendations that capture the status and level of certification for repositories and service providers, and also on increasing the efficiency in repository certification with the aim that a service is certified once and repositories using the service can reference the service certification. There is link to collaborative notes file in the chat, and I kindly ask Lauren to put it in the chat again. So please check in there, leave your name, leave your contact information. We are, this is a working group that is still in the making. And today you will help contributing to the case statement. But I first wanted to introduce the co-chairs of the group, and most of them are also here today. So we have Wim Hugo from DANS. We have Alison Lister from Oxford E-Research Center. We have Lauren Maxwell from the Heidelberg University Hospital. Mohan Ramamurthy from Unidata Program Center at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, and Max Wilkinson from Austrian Research Data Commons. The working group is also supported by RDA Tiger project, which is coordinated by RDA Europe, where Ryan O'Connell and me, myself, are lending support to the group. We do have a packed schedule today. If the slide goes forward, just give it a second. I think my internet just froze, but we'll get there. Okay, now it went forward too much. Here, there's the schedule. So we are introducing you to the topic, to the background of the working group, why there is need for this working group. And then, as I said before, we are inviting your feedback on the case statement because the working group is in the process of finalizing the case statement and putting it out then for community review. So your feedback at this point in time is invaluable. And after the feedback, there's time for open discussion. But before we get to all of that, we wanted to know a bit about you, to know where you're from and which stakeholder groups you represent. So if you kindly could log into this Menti, there is the QR code or there is the entrance code. Then we have 2 questions for you, which you should be able to access now. And we do expect that most of the audience here this morning or this afternoon will be from Europe or Oceania. I wanted to see if there are any insomniacs across the Atlantic from us. But nope. No insomniacs here from the West. Okay, thank you. So the time slot of the session determines the audience a bit here. But then we also wanted to know which stakeholder group do you represent? So repository managers, certification authorities, repository service providers, data stewards, repository founders, researchers, or Anybody else who we missed on this list? Okay, I see there's quite a large group of others. If you could please perhaps put into the chat which stakeholder community you represent, that would be great. But there's quite a few repository managers in the room alongside the many others. And then certification authorities, repository service providers, and also some data stewards and one researcher. Welcome. If you want to expand on your background, please do put it into the chat. But at this point, I would hand it over, having a sense of the room and the location. I would hand it over to Lauren, who will talk us through the background to this working group.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Could you go to the next slide then? So one thing that we wanted to think about, because we're thinking about expanding certification for repositories, we wanted to ask folks, how would you define a repository? So what are kind of the minimum criteria that you're looking for when you think about what would define a repository? So maybe we can wait just a few more seconds to see if anybody has a response to that. Yeah. Great. So something, so I think what's interesting is to posit these definitions. So obviously we didn't have a lot of time to think about this, but have some time to respond against the criteria for certification of a repository. So we can see that a repository is a facility that enables data reuse, a platform for sharing and preservation, an archive that provides quality assurance. And again, we see the word preservation, a place to maintain the accessibility and availability of digital assets, place for dissemination of research outputs. And so we might, after today's presentation, just go through and summarize these with a bit more detail, but it's interesting to think about what, how we think of repositories just off the top of our heads, what stands out to us as important, and then compare that to the criteria for certification. So one thing that comes to mind that isn't here is a sustainability plan, but I think that that's implicit in some of this language around preservation. Great. Okay, let's see. So we can go to the next slide. So why we started this group, and this is something that I think it was a birds of a feather that we had at the last at P21 in Austria, where we discussed kind of folks' concerns about the current repository certification landscape and ways that we thought that we could try to move things forward. And so the fundamental problem that we're trying to address in this group is a problem of demand and supply. So we have quite a number of data sets. We have a number of data sets that are shared through services like Zenodo or DataSite or Figshare. So currently DataSite is really leading with close to 40 million data sets. And we know that we have about 5 million peer-reviewed publications per year. All of, or many of those will be producing data and have an obligation to share those data. And then in terms of repositories, we have basically this nice iceberg figure that Vim has put together, where we can see that there are very few certified repositories. So that's Core Trust Seal or Nestor, the ISO certification. We have many more repositories, so about by a factor of 10 that are registered in R3 Data or DataSite or Fair Sharing. And then we have many other repositories that are not registered. And that figure is probably an underestimate. And so we find that the certification, you know, despite the collaboration and obviously the years of work that has gone into this certification, the certifications is not meeting our needs to understand which repositories are trusted or not, because we have so few repositories that are certified, and we have a larger need given the number of data sets that we are producing. So if you follow along with Vim's back of the envelope estimates, we can think about approximately 5 curated data sets per day that should be uploaded into each repository, not considering the repositories that are certified, but rather the larger number of repositories that at least exist as registered repositories. Yes, so some comments from Vim that this is not intended as an example of a repository, but rather as a count of the annual data sets. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So one thing that we were interested in getting from folks is understanding how important different issues are in terms of thinking about this problem of supply and demand. So we have the need for trusted repositories, but we have very few repositories that have been certified as trusted repositories by the existing certification services. So which of these issues would you say are the most important to you or to your organization in terms of thinking about the limited number of repositories that are certified? So we'll give you a couple of minutes to address the Menti poll. Great. Let's see, so we have the highest number of folks voting for generalist repositories cannot currently be certified, and then similar number of folks voting for binary certification, so a lack of modular certification, certified components of the certification process, and also a lack of certification for supporting services, a lack of awareness, and again, modular certification, which is related to this idea of binary certification. Great, and then, so all of these seem to be important to folks, but those are the most important ones. So we could go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is a really nice diagram that Vim also put together, thinking about what are the issues in terms of the demand. So the demand referring to the production of data sets. So those data sets might start out uncurated and then move to formal curation or self-curation or crowd curation, and then the supply of repositories. So here we're talking about repositories that are uncurated. So these repositories may not even be registered on a service like Fair Sharing or R3 Data. They may not even have themselves a persistent identifier. And then we can think about how those, the demand for curated and preserved data interacts with the supply of curated and well-supported repositories that address some of the concerns that folks raised earlier about quality and so what the yellow box here is referring to is that this is a larger system. So we know that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of thinking about the mechanisms for curating data, the rate of data curation and the quality of that curation. We know that there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of curating data for deposition in repositories, so ensuring that those data have similar metadata and can be found within the repositories. And then we know that there's also work that needs to be done in terms of the uncurated flow of data from uncurated data to uncurated repositories, but where we're proposing that this group really work is within the yellow box on A, B, and C within this system. So we are thinking about addressing the rate of certification. So moving uncurated repositories to curated repositories, which currently we know is too complex and too costly. We've set the bar too high, and we're not able to certify the number of repositories that we need to certify. We'd also like to address the rate, the scope of certification. So we want to think about certifying other types of outputs and modular certification rather than just a binary certification of the repository or not. And then we're also interested in addressing the certification of service providers that can be external to the repository itself. So the certification of one service provider for a repository could then apply to different repositories and meet the need for the modular certification of that service. So this is where we're proposing to work in this working group. I go to the next slide. And then just given kind of the very brief overview of what we've told you so far about where we think the issue is in terms of the demand for trusted repositories and the number of repositories that are certified under our current kind of approach to certification, and also where we've said we want to work, which is in the yellow box that we discussed in terms of thinking about really working on modular certification, increasing the rate of certification, the scope of certification, and the certification of service providers. Is there anything else that comes to mind as a priority for you when you're thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to really move forward the landscape of certification of repositories to meet this demand? So anything that we've missed so far? So I just put the link to the Menti poll back in the chat. Nice. Okay. So thanks for this response. That thinking about whether services are comparable, thinking about making visible catalogs from technical service providers, the benefits of certification. I think it's very important. Anything else come to mind of issues that are of importance to you or your group, but we have not covered as of yet? Do we have a defined standard which will be certified? So maybe if you could provide a bit of clarification there, and you can feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, just as a matter of interest, we will be revisiting this question of standardization a bit later also, but you're welcome to also tell us what you think now.
Great. Well, this is a very nice start. And again, as Vim mentioned early on, this is we're really looking for kind of your collaborative inputs here, and we have obviously the draft case statement, but it's very much in draft form, and we're very happy to have your edits. So great. And we have another point here of designated community need is certification. Even a need. So thinking about checklists versus certification, that's an interesting point. Great. So I think we could move on from here to the next slide, where we'll get into the case statements, and Vim will be presenting this part. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Villa, you had your hand up briefly. I don't know whether you wanted to say something. No? Okay. All right, so the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to dive a bit more deeply into the case study, which is at the moment a synthesis from 2 birds of a feather sessions at previous plenaries. So if you can move on to the next slide, Lisa. So the first slide deals with our working group intentions and the outcomes that we want to achieve. And on the left-hand side, sort of our intentions are, broadly speaking, to establish a set of modular repository features and characteristics, confirming and assisting the needs of and expectations of the community in respect of the trustworthy repository ecosystem, and stressing that this might go broader than just certified repositories, but also potentially repositories or supporting services for which more information is available generally to the end user community. We would like to determine which of these features can be delegated to, for instance, data repository service providers. And we want to define and describe alternatives to formal certification that could improve the appraisal and selection of repositories that are not formally certified, as well as the services contributing to them. So that's broadly speaking our intentions. And then the outcomes that we're hoping for would be to contribute to an improvement to the number and scale of successful certifications on the one hand, but also to extend the scope of certification beyond data repositories, because initially we thought of reducing the scope only to data repository aspects or considerations. But it's clear that there is a significant need also to understand the trustworthiness requirements for other repositories, for code and software and semantic artifacts and so on. And much of it will overlap, so we might as well try to extend the scope to these other research outputs as well. And then we would like to assist the community to make better informed decisions about the use of infrastructure while we are busy working on improving the certification ecosystem. So broadly speaking, by a number of means, we want to broaden the umbrella of trust that extends to our repository infrastructure in general. So on the next slide, if you have any comments or ideas or additional thoughts on the intentions that we have and the outcomes that we should be pursuing, then maybe let us know by way of a comment. We thought that adding these comments this way would be more efficient in a virtual meeting with quite a large number of participants. But you're, of course, welcome to also add ideas into the chat or into the meeting notes. So I'll give a few minutes for this because we have a bit of time for you to think about it and to tell us what you think. Yeah. So if you are considering that we are more or less on track, we could be moving on. If you have some ideas about extending the scope of our intentions, then you can always, of course, add it into the chat or into the meeting notes. I'll give another minute or two because it takes a little bit of thinking and thought organization usually to respond to these. I think the second one is a good example of what we've identified as, let's say, characteristics or features offered by services and repositories for that matter, that are important to the community when they select a service provider or a repository, but isn't generally, well, sometimes not part of the scope of a formal certification or explicitly part of it. It's not simple to find, let's say, repositories that meet certain criteria when it comes to these performance or feature type characteristics. The machine actionability is also quite an important thought, because if we have any intention of scaling up the rate of certification, then some way of machine actionability in evaluation or selection will be quite important. So that, I think, is a very good suggestion. I'll allow another half minute or so for you to contribute on this item.
And I would say to the point about, is there coordination with the data repository attributes working group? So both Alison and I were part of that working group. And so we are using, we will definitely use the outputs of that working group. And I don't think that there will be a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
I mean, besides us making use of that work.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So if we can move on to the next one. So the next section deals with the value proposition. And this slide is a little bit dense, but let's quickly have a look. So broadly speaking, we want to work through three ideas in the working group's activities. The first is to compile an inventory of expectations, which of course will include current certification criteria and principles or objectives. Then there's a prioritization step to be taken. That means that we need to figure out which of these criteria, including the current certification scope, is applicable in different contexts, which may be for different research outputs, for different communities even, and certainly for different components of the ecosystem, such as service providers and so on. And then there's an appraisal and verification step, which means that we need to test these with the community, but we also need to figure out how the community wants to evaluate compliance or alignment with these criteria. And stressing again that we might end up, quite likely, with a set of recommendations where there is a continuum of appraisal ranging from informal self-assessment all the way to certification. We'll deal with that aspect a little bit later. So on the right-hand side, there's a graphic explaining the process. And then on the next slide, if you think that we are missing any important things that we should be looking at process-wise or in terms of our work program, then please add that to our list for us. So first there is the inventory of expectations. If you think that we are what the kind of things are that we should consider to compile specifications, at the characteristics in outputs such as the Global Open Research Commons inventory, POSI, which is the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure, and other similar sources. And then, of course, also outputs that were generated by other RDA groups. So in that broad scope, if you think we're missing anything of great importance, let us know of other sources of expectations that we should be looking at. Okay. If not, then maybe on to the next question, Lisa. So the next one is has to do with how we should go about prioritizing area. So as I said, we thought of thinking along the lines that is applicable to different elements in the ecosystem, such as services and repositories and other actors in the ecosystem. So that's the one perspective. The other one is to look at potentially domain-specific nuances in the need for certification. And the other one has to do with the type of research output. So those are the three perspectives that we are currently considering and figuring out which criteria apply in which of these contexts. So if we're missing something significant along those, any dimension, then now's the time to tell us about that. And being fully aware, of course, that the question of differentiation by discipline is potentially a bridge too far, because I think the working group will not have time to do that in any significant detail. Okay. And again, if we move on too quickly and you think of something, please add it into the collaborative notes or into the chat. Yeah, so I fully agree with that statement, and we are heading towards this perspective that some criteria that are, or some features or characteristics that are applicable to repositories and services are important for selection, but they may not form part of a formal certification. So that's, I think, a very important point that we recognize already. Yeah, so we're working towards this idea of appraisal, which is sort of not really an assessment, but an indication of the capabilities of a service or a repository so that people can select ones that they are looking for without them necessarily forming part of a formalized self-assessment or an audited assessment. Okay, again, if we're moving too quickly, please add to the notes. And then the last part of this question relates to the basis of appraisal and the mechanism of appraisal. So here again, we identified these two perspectives or dimensions. The one is that we have a sort of a broad group of desirable features and characteristics that we might identify. And some of them are refined by the community into sets of best practices and recommendations. And then eventually some of them are codified as standards and specifications that have a more, let's say, managed life cycle. And then there's also a mechanism of appraisal, ranging from situations where there's no assessment all the way through to self-assessment with or without some benchmarking and provision of evidence, all the way to audited or reviewed assessments. And in both cases, these dimensions don't have discrete elements, but it's sort of like a fuzzy continuum of practices. And then the thing that links the basis of appraisal to the mechanism of appraisal is this concept of a community benchmark, which can come from published best practices and recommendations, or from standards and specifications, and we can apply them to any kind of assessment, I guess. So bearing this in mind, the next slide is slightly more complex. It's the most difficult question we have to answer today. So if you can move on to it, you'll see on your screen that there's basically three things that you need to answer. And that is, what is the basis and mechanism of assessment in your view that you currently experience or are used to, what you would like it to be in future, and what you think is desirable, because number 2 and number 3 might not be exactly the same. So as an example, you could say that currently our basis of assessment is a self-assessment based on our own set of desirable features and characteristics. But in future, we would like it to be a self-assessed, a self-assessment with benchmarks and evidence based on best practices and recommendations. So that's the way to go about filling this in. So if you have questions, please let us know, because as I say, this is a slightly more complex question, but maybe an efficient way to get the feedback. Okay, and then while we're filling this in, what we're seeing on the screen is a representation of an average, but behind the scenes, Menti is keeping the individual responses. So if there is a wide difference of opinion in two groups on any of the questions, we'll be able to figure that out, even though the chart only shows us an average at the moment.
So RDA is saying that it might be too short of a time to process this, but perhaps it's still a valuable exercise to think about, you know, where are we and where do we want to go?
Oh, no, I wasn't suggesting we judge everybody else on my level of response. No, I'm sure everybody else will get it.
Yep. So Hervé, I think it's fine if you send us your thoughts afterwards, or in the notes document, of course. And I realize that it's how shall I say, moving from death by PowerPoint to death by Mentimeter is maybe also not the the ideal situation.
Yeah, all good. Cheers, Ben.
Okay, so we're getting steady responses and we still have a bit of time, so please continue. Okay, I'll leave it for another minute and then we can move on. Yeah, Roxanne, I agree. I think it's a heavy schedule with the virtual meetings especially. I find it a bit more challenging than the face-to-face meetings. Okay, thanks very much. We've got a good response rate here. So thanks, Hervé. I think they do interact, that's true. And there's maybe a sort of a fuzziness in the other direction as well. Okay, our next topic is the benefits and the value proposition that the working group intends to deliver. So if we can move on to the slide that defines the value proposition, we are revisiting our diagram that describes the process in very broad terms. And then on the right-hand side, we are thinking that it might be possible to improve efficiency of certification in 3 ways. One of them might be that component services can be certified once and referenced many times by other components in the infrastructure or in the ecosystem that is seeking certification. That we can maybe decentralize and modularize certification, and that we can improve the rate of appraisal and certification in one way or another. We might be able also, as we indicated earlier, to be made applicable to non-data repositories and can accelerate the movement towards assessment and future certification of such repositories, but it's not an explicit part of what we intend to deliver. And then also work towards a community consensus on how to select the most appropriate repository for a service or a service for a given context, which, as we said, might be a combination of formal certification-like criteria together with other desirable characteristics that the end user community are interested in, but does not form part of certification. So that's the broad value proposition that we are thinking about at the moment. And on the next slide, as usual, you can tell us whether we're missing anything or if there are side effects or benefits that we haven't thought about and should be considering. Yeah, so the inputs for future HE projects, I think we'll deal with it in the next slide, if I remember correctly. But that is true because there are some European open calls at the moment, or calls that have just closed, where much of the same topics are being addressed. So the working group will probably have to work closely with these projects. And then criteria for auditors. Yeah, I think that's also interesting. If those criteria are too strict, then we have a supply problem again with the audit part of the business. But on the other hand, if one wants to open up or liberalize the certification landscape, then maybe one should also determine who can express an opinion or a formal opinion about an assessment. Yeah, I think this certification is also the fact that it's sort of like a single value and users don't see the component parts. That's quite a useful and important idea that we should maybe think about. Yeah, I think this almost there's a certified world and then there's nothing else kind of situation is also worth considering. So on the one hand, one wants to improve the knowledge that end users have about the capabilities and features supported by a much wider range of repositories, including, for argument's sake, Zenodo, which is a very good example. There's now something like 350,000 data sets deposited in Zenodo. But on the other hand, you also want to maintain the value of formal certification, but not make it a limiting factor. That's sort of how I would see that. Modular certifications must be interoperable. Yes, good point. Okay, so thanks for those contributions. Then maybe to the next one, Lisa. Ongoing and recent initiatives. We've mentioned them a few times in the discussion thus far. So we are looking at, of course, existing certifications. There was an indication in the chat about the German standard or a German certification scheme that has quite a large number of repositories certified that will certainly add to this list. Then within RDA, there are 5 other working groups or interest groups that we need to engage with or that we could identify thus far. And then there are some other initiatives. Important ones there are these future projects in the EU that will look at networks of trustworthy repositories, and then also at effectively the certification and assessment landscape in Europe. And then there are a few other projects that are ongoing where we can engage them to make sure that we have a good sense of all the requirements and features and characteristics that we should consider. So if you can think of any other initiatives or projects or RDA groups that we are missing, then please add them in the next slide. Yeah, so ISO 27000, I think, and one is a good point. Yeah, Gavin, thanks. I think the Elixir inputs will actually be very useful because I think it's a very important additional perspective that we need to take into account. So if you can point us in the right direction and tell us who we might potentially engage with, that will be very good. Yeah, of course, the long-term data preservation task force recommendations. Good. I think we just missed that without any excuses. All right, so I think that's enough time. But again, if you think of anything, let us know. It's of course not the last word on this. Yeah, so that last one is also interesting because it is true that there are ERICs or research infrastructures, informal or formal ones, that also have sets of criteria for joining the networks or participating in the infrastructure. That's a very good point because they will already have potentially many of these other features and considerations that are discipline specific that are not necessarily part of the current portfolio of certified criteria. Okay, that was good inputs. And then our final question or aspect that we deal with in the case statement is our work plan. So there's a summary again of our little picture on the left-hand side, right-hand side. And then the work plan has got 3 lanes, as it were. There's a timeline with phases of roughly 3 or 4 months at a time. The plenaries are noted more or less when they occur, with a note that there is not a virtual plenary planned in about a year from now. And then we intend to have free community consultations together with a very specific engagement with Court Trust Seal, because they have indicated in the Birds of a Feather sessions previously that they would be willing to serve as a test case for the recommendations that come from the working group in respect of service providers, because that's a specific aspect that they are quite interested in. So we're planning to do that sort of 2/3 more or less through the work plan, to have this feedback and engagement session with Court Trust Seal, be ready to share draft recommendations with them, and then to get their feedback on that. So that's more or less what we have in mind work plan wise. It might be slightly ambitious to have these 3 community consultations, but I think this working group in particular should be strongly guided by community input. I don't think we have a choice. It's not something that can be done in isolation, and we need very frequent and constructive engagements with the community on this. So I think we'll have to work within the time limitations to the best of our ability to get this done. Okay, so on the next slide, if you can think of anything again that we are missing, or comments that it's too ambitious or are missing important things that we should be thinking about, then let us know. And there's a bit of time, 2 to 3 minutes for you to do so. Yeah, and one of the things that we could consider potentially is some kind of a dedicated event, but I think the funding aspects of this might be a bit more challenging. One of the community engagements as a specific event. Yeah, so the response that we have there, looking at usage metrics, like a project counter, if you don't mind elaborating on that, because I'm not sure I catch exactly what is meant.
So there's this organization called Project Counter, and they have specific usage metrics for databases. I'm not sure if it would be part of this work or if it would be looked at, but it may be an interesting one if that is something that is to be looked at.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up this part of our session. Thanks very much for your inputs. And as we'll see when we discuss the next steps, these all go into finalizing a draft of the case statement for public review or community review before we submit it to RDA. All right, so we've left quite a bit of time for open discussion. And there are 3 more questions related to more general aspects that we have added. But maybe let's first open the floor for anyone who wishes to say a bit more about their perspectives or add their 2 cents in respect of the working group's activities and focus and so on. So please go ahead. Just looking through the notes, if there are other things that we should be maybe discussing. Okay, so while you're thinking, maybe we can move on to one of the more general questions. If you maybe think a little bit, because there's a lot of, let's say, talk about the need to certify service providers, technical service providers in the ecosystem. So if you can think a little bit about the formal criteria that you think might apply to these service providers, but do not necessarily apply to repositories. So repositories generally have to, if they want to be certified, have to demonstrate aspects such as sustainability and proper governance, proper processes for things like curation and appraisal and preservation, open and sustainable technical infrastructure, and the like. So if you have thought about aspects of the service environment that might be important to assess in one way or another, yeah, service level agreements would be a good one, because at the moment, of course, those service level agreements can be anything, but maybe they need to tick a few boxes to be adequate. So that's a good consideration. Yeah, so welcome, Murayama-san. We haven't spoken for a long time, but I think your point is also good in the chat, that there is a community who's reluctant to improve their standard of data preservation. So some form of softened standards or, let's say, graded performance levels or benchmarks might be a good way to address that.
Yes, actually, it depends on their country or region or discipline, but still, sometimes I'm finding the so much reluctant feeling in the researchers community, and yeah, this could be a part of the point in case to develop the community repository community. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, good, thanks. And I think the drift of what I'm seeing in the comments on screen is, I think that's quite pertinent, is that many of these service providers are more, how shall I say, at an infrastructure level. So general IT infrastructure type standards or processes or quality assurance mechanisms, ITIL and ISO, FIT-SM and so on could be applicable. That's a good point. Machine actionability. Yeah, and IT standards, there might be interoperability standards, of course. That sort of also speaks to the comment about automatic ingest and package versioning. Yeah, the code of conduct is interesting because, yeah, there's a sort of a legal interoperability perspective, maybe, if one wants to put it in broad terms, where whatever legal arrangements one makes with depositors in a repository environment needs to be propagated to the service provider in one way or another, because they become a sub-processor. So in GDPR terms in Europe. So that might be a very important consideration. Okay. So maybe then to stimulate a more thought and discussion, the next more general question. So apart from what is applicable maybe to the service providers, and we have touched on this a little bit already, what are these informal or additional criteria that you think might be important? So I always use the throwaway example of people might be considering a repository or a service just on the basis of cost, or whether they can accommodate very large files and not care too much about the rest of the certification landscape. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for here, sort of like these additional criteria that could be important for end users, but are not currently covered when people are talking about certification or repository criteria.
Wim, may I ask a question? It's just that in the title of the working group, it says criteria and certification for trustworthy technical repository service providers. But it seems that if you go on with this modular approach and so on, you will go beyond that scope of just technical service providers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So our sense is that that's an important output. But in investigating this, we are probably going to come across a whole lot of other criteria that are generally applicable, and some of them may need to be more formally assessed or even certified, and some not. So I think just focusing on the service provider environment narrowly is not solving the problem a bit more holistically. And someone will have to go back and look at these other perspectives anyway. So we're not necessarily going to make any binding recommendations about them, but we will certainly investigate more widely than we intend to recommend, if you can put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, your focus is on the technical service providers, but with possible recommendations on how to continue.
Yeah. But I think if we narrow it down to the technical service providers for our investigation and information gathering phases, that's not going to be very useful. I think we must start a bit more widely before we focus.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, the only thing, but it will work out once this work starts, of course, is that, and the comment came from me, that the end user just sees a badge and they don't go and look into the details of what that badge actually means. So yeah, if a technical service provider, what can a technical service provider do? They can give a badge on the technical certification, for example, but on governance and the financial sustainability and everything like that, they cannot say much because one is buying probably their service. But for an end user, usually a badge of honor doesn't really matter what it means. It's just something visual that say, okay, this one is okay. So that's always a problem. It's the same problem I have with the fair labeling. And they see, okay, it has a high fair score, but they don't go and look into the details of what it actually means. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you because there was a break in the audio. Yeah, so I agree. I think if one can find a way, in addition to say that, yes, the service provider is certified, but what does it actually mean? Almost like altmetrics, here is a score, but there are sort of sub-elements with contributing scores kind of thing. That is important for making selection decisions. And then, of course, the other aspect is that even if there is a certified service that you can plug into some of your criteria as a trustworthy repository seeking or a repository seeking certification, you still have to take responsibility for many of the governance and legal and sustainability aspects. So yeah, I think it's not a given that it absolves a repository of its responsibilities for many of these aspects. Okay, so we're getting quite an extra set of inputs here. Okay. All right, and then our last sort of question in the list that deals with more general aspects. If you could move on, thanks. Do any of you know of or currently use a technical service provider? Because I am fairly directly involved in the landscape, but I know of only a few, to be honest. And maybe I'm missing the large number that is out there. But if you currently use one or are aware of one, then let us know. And I think if I recall from one of the first slides, we don't have a strong representation from service providers today, which is also something maybe for us to follow up on. So if you know of any of these service providers, I'm aware of a few. I can follow up with them and get them more engaged, but it will be really helpful if you can give us pointers to others in the landscape that you're aware of that we can start engaging with, because they are an important part of this stakeholder group, and we need to improve their participation. Yeah, Archivium is right. Yeah, so I think that comment is true. We haven't defined things like repositories or service providers very well. I think that's a part of what we put in the work plan as a sort of an ecosystem or a conceptual model to define the participants in the ecosystem and how we know which is which, how we identify them or characterize them. So it is a deficiency because the definitions at the moment are quite fuzzy, I agree. But it could be a software provider, but I wouldn't go that far because I think the current certification criteria are not so worried about the software providers. They're more interested in their characteristics, whether they are open source providers and have some sustainability and so on. So that could be one. One that comes to mind for me are service providers that I believe we will see increasingly around quality assurance, centralized services for fair assessment of deposits and so on, that are not handled by the repository itself, but in essence, you are outsourcing some of the curation and quality assurance tasks to a service. So that would be an example for me. Long-term preservation is another obvious one, and so on. Hervé?
Yeah, I'm just wondering because obviously a huge chunk of the archive projects was people basically wrapping existing code and software solutions in a service wrapper. So if I choose to do some of those locally as a repository, and or I could outsource basically the use of the same code base to Archivum, then I think there is a level of desirability for having those two functions comparable at some level, at least being able to say this equivalent activity is being undertaken by me locally using a software product versus by a third party. And I think that especially comes home when the local person and the third party might be using exactly the same code.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. So that's an interesting one, is to say that by virtue of a certification of a service, if one uses the exact same code, it means that you are also effectively certified, something like that. Or don't have to provide any additional evidence, maybe.
Yeah, but it also works to the other end of the stack, which is, you know, if I'm working my way through planning on installing 150 different bits of code locally to meet my needs, but then I can easily map that to an archiver service provision, service catalog and say, oh, hang on a minute, these guys will do the same job in a bundle. I mean, that's what I mean about the comparison across the functions and activities, understanding what these different providers do and making them comparable. Yeah, that supports selection in the same way that we're talking about characteristics to support repository selection, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I might still get certified if I don't provide secure access to sensitive research data. You know, that might be irrelevant to certification in some cases, but it's certainly important to repository selection if you've got sensitive data. So I think the selection aspect here depends on comparability.
Yep. Okay, and then Wille and Duerke also had some comments. Wille, maybe you first. So I think if you want to elaborate on this idea that some of the more general IT, let's say, performance features apply to repositories because they are services.
Well, in the ETI Foundation, I have worked number of different kind of services, and we have those IT or actually service management certificates, and those certificates are in quite general level and so on. And it opens the door to think about these kind of repositories also as a service, because there is a not only technical solution, but there is a different kind of processes, how to manage different things and so on. So I think that these are somehow related. Of course, not all those features of those certificates or standards actually, but there is something what could apply in this initiative. I think that this is a very good idea to handle this kind of certification. Yes, but that was my point of view.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, because at least at Dance, we are getting increasing questions also from the end user community about more formal information technology related security and standards. So I think the universities, for instance, in the Netherlands are looking at compliance aspects of the services that they use. And as a result, those questions get forwarded to us. Are you ISO 27001 certified, and so on and so on? What do you do in respect of very specific questions for information security, GDPR, backup and failover and the like? So it might become more important in future because of that driver too. So it's a worthwhile extension of maybe selection elements, if not certification directly, that we need to consider. Dewar-Key, I think, sorry.
Yeah, I just saying that I fully agree. I faced that the ISO 27K question normally in all project where we have any kind of sensitive or even a little bit sensitive data. So or some kind of personal data, there is a question that, okay, are you certified with that one? Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then Dewar-Key, Blumen from KU Leuven has a comment about software trustworthiness. I think this is in respect of maybe the repository software that people are using, for argument's sake, Dataverse or Invenio, and to what extent it might be possible to cover some of the certification or quality aspects of your operation by having the software offering certified. So, Dewar-Key, I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, I don't know if Wim is frozen for you as well, but he was waiting for me. So yeah, to elaborate on it, it was, I think, the item that came up the most during the initial Birds of a Feather session for people who are working on certification for their own repository. For example, for Dataverse, which we've recently gone through for Core Trust Seal, a lot of the questions that you're answering are just explaining how Database works, which doesn't make sense and is a time investment that you would love to be able to skip. And so at the time, that was one of the suggestions, that you could make specific software providers, not necessarily service providers, certified, so that if you use their software in their standard implementation, that you can skip certain questions. And I think for me, that focus is a bit lacking here, because I feel like it's very focused on service providers, and it skews towards a ecosystem where a lot of people are going to have to use service providers instead of institutions being able to set up their own repositories using open source systems, even though that is very common, and using open source systems is also advised, for example, from Europe. So I would like to see that a bit more here, perhaps, that's also included and considered. I know it's difficult because everyone can do whatever they want with software, but I think maybe there can be certain parameters in place to actually work that out in some way and include it in this working group.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, my sound seemed to have disappeared. So I didn't catch the last part of what Duerky was saying, but I think it's an important point to review the extent to which, let's say, embedded processes or workflows in software, for instance, could satisfy some of the requirements that we see. So I think that's good. And then, Hervé, you had your hand up, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good point. I mean, I think this speaks to the stuff about methodologies as well. Dataverse has already done some work about how they best, some guidance on how what they do can support applications for core trust seal.
Yep.
So I guess it's the difference between whether they are in their entirety certified as a service provider, or where certain bits of the evidence that they provide as part of providing that service are considered acceptable for certification like core trust seal. And that's where I think you start to get into the a certification provider providing certification of somebody else's evidence. Yeah, and that's where transparency and self-assessment might work a little better as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is a good point, because offhand I can think of something in Dataverse that you could certify modularly, so to speak, and that is to say, we think that this process for recording provenance and versioning in Dataverse is adequate for the expectations of the certification authority. And then, you don't have to elaborate on that. You can just say that I'm using Dataverse to support this workflow in my repository. Something along those lines, I think, is where we might end up. Yeah. Okay. All right, so there's also a comment, maybe we're almost out of time, but maybe a last elaboration of the comment on national solutions, because I think that's also interesting. The NRENs and the cyber infrastructure providers nationally have some shared services that could be useful. So I don't know who posted that comment, but if you want to elaborate, please go ahead. No? Okay, so I think that concludes the question and answer session as well. So thank you very much for your inputs. I think it will shape our case statement and our work into the near future very well. So back to Lisa.
Yes, so thank you everybody very much for your input, which will contribute to the case statement, help to take it further. And as Wim just said, the aim now is to finalize the case statement and bring it out to community review. We hope that you have included yourself in the collaborative notes so that we can be in touch, and also invite your contribution to the working group through, if you're interested, working group membership. The working group is also soon deciding on monthly meetings, and this information will then be shared. There is a repeat session of this session next week on May 22nd. So if you know of somebody who should have been here today but couldn't, pass on word about the repeat session. If you want to participate again on in the session next week, you're very welcome. that's it from our side. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of the plenary.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
And I will
Thank you. Bye.
stop the share and stop the recording.